Hello and welcome to Game 8 in the 2024 World Chess Championship. As the tension builds because we are entering the second half of the tournament, championship I should say, because there's only 14 games. If they're tied after 14 games, they will go into quicker tie-breaking games. But this eighth game is interesting. Let's dive in here. It looks like the world champion, 32-year-old Ding Liren, begins with c4 here, which is the English opening. Excuse me. And the young challenger, 18-year-old Gukesh Damaraju of India, he responds with e5 here. It's almost like, possibly a reversed Sicilian defense where black usually pushes to c5 after white has gone to e4. So let's see how the game continues. We have knight to c3, a logical follow-up, as now the pawn and the knight cover this important d5 square. And the game continues with an immediate attack on the knight here. So according to the computer, this is the English opening reversed Sicilian Kramnik-Shirov counterattack. So that's a mouthful there in that opening variation. So will the young challenger give up his bishop pair to capture the knight and possibly double pawns? Let's see what happens. Well, he's not given the chance, as now there is a counterattack. Now, normally you don't want to move a piece twice in the opening until you get all your pieces developed, your king castled, but there are exceptions to every general chess rule, such as this one, where the knight jumps forward, counterattacking the bishop, and because the bishop is unprotected, let's see what happens here. The bishop retreats back to e7 here. And now, if the knight captures, getting rid of black's bishop pair, it will help the development for black here by recapturing with the knight, possibly. I guess the queen could capture as well. So let's see what happens. It looks like the world champion decides not to go after the bishop, which would help his opponent's development. Instead, he develops a knight, immediately attacking this unprotected pawn. And there is the option of this pawn pushing forward, chasing the knight. But, will the knight be weakened by pushing forward before it gets enough support? Well, let's see what happens. The young challenger instead finds the best move, d6, which just fortifies the pawn, kind of solidifying the center a little bit here. And this also allows the bishop to develop along this diagonal. So now we have g3 being played. So white, is preparing to develop his bishop, and then he'll be able to castle. So now we have an attack on this knight. So the best move is to go ahead and knock out the bishop pair. And now we have the knight capture. Apparently that's best. Now, in the Sicilian defense, a lot of times there can be a battle here. And even in a Caro-Kann, where you normally bring this pawn up, there can be a battle here by pushing this pawn. And this kind of frees the position for black. Now, at the moment, if this pawn pushes forward, this pawn would not be protected anymore, and the knight could capture. But perhaps that is a future plan, pushing the pawn here. There is the option of maybe pushing forward, attacking the knight with the pawn, then driving this pawn forward. So let's see what happens. We have bishop fianchettoing. White is ready to castle. And now an interesting move. Often you do not want to push the f-pawn and create weaknesses along this diagonal aimed at your king. But, black is ready to castle here. So if it looks like there could be trouble, he could castle. Let's see what the young challenger has in mind. But first, we have castling by white, and the bishop develops here to e6, the best move in the position. White still has a slight edge at this point, and perhaps this is why this f-pawn was pushed forward. It prevents the knight from harassing the bishop, and the bishop also has the option to drop back here. So let's see how the game continues. We have b3 being played, perhaps to develop the bishop along this diagonal. The bishop could land here, putting pressure on this pawn in the future, or the bishop could just go to b2, although at the moment there's a lot of pawns here blocking that diagonal. So the game continues with d5 gaining space in the center, and we have bishop developing here instead, which, as I said, if you develop along this diagonal, the bishop would kind of be biting on granite. That's sometimes used to describe this, where the bishop is just kind of blocked and can't really do much because the pawns are just stopping or most of the movement along that diagonal. So here we have an attack on the knight. The game continues with castling by black. The computer states that that is best. And the game is pretty even here, just a slight edge by white. Now we do have a pin of this knight to the rook. So the game continues with rook developing towards the center. And often it's a good move to place rooks on open or half open files. But if there aren't any, then you can go behind pawns that you've pressed forward or that you plan to exchange, because once this pawn is exchanged, there could be a fight for the c file here. So the young challenger pushes a pawn, gaining space on the queen side, perhaps with the idea of pushing here, attacking, opening up the a file for the rook, a possible attack on the bishop here. So the game continues with a knight retreat. Now, normally you don't want to bring a knight to the edge of the board unless you have a good reason. So the world champion is probably looking to reposition this knight, or he wants the bishop to open up here, have a little more scope. So let's see how things continue. Rook to e8, centralizing this rook, and now we have a pawn push of f4. As this rook is kind of trapped in here, a push of the f-pawn could perhaps give this rook a little more mobility. So capture and a recapture by the rook. So now the rook has a little bit more scope, possibly maybe an idea of swinging over here and aiming at the king side, but that could be blocked with a pawn. So the game continues with capture, and things are opening up a little bit here. So after pawn recaptures, now we have knight attacking this rook. And what will the rook do? Well, let's find out. Centralization of the rook. Interesting move here. But now the game has swung slightly in black's favor. So, let's see how things continue here. Will this rook become a target in the center? No attack on the rook here immediately. And Gukesh finds the best move in the position. Placing a knight on the edge of the board. But probably with ideas of moving it forward, maybe wanting to place the knight on an outpost here. And it's interesting that both sides have a knight on the edge of the board. So the game continues with knight developing, perhaps with the threat of jumping forward, putting pressure on the bishop. Also, maybe trying to discourage the knight from jumping in here to b4. So the game continues with queen developing, getting off the back rank, connecting the rooks. Connected rooks work a little bit better when they can work in tandem, protecting one another. And this gives the rooks a little more scope to decide what open files or half open files they need to move to as the game progresses. So queen is kind of aiming down here towards the king side, but not much of a threat at the moment. So the game continues with a knight move, attacking the bishop here. So let's see how things progress. We have a retreat, now a discovered attack on the rook. Will there be a rook trade here? No. We have, well, not at the moment. We have a pawn pushing forward, and apparently this is the best move for white. So, both players finding many of the best moves according to the computer. So here we have the rook protected. So once again, will there be an exchange of rooks? No. The knight jumps forward, blocking a possible exchange here. And the best move in the position. An outpost for this knight. To chase the knight away, you would either have to maybe drop this knight back. Then you could maybe push the pawn. So let's see what happens. The knight does drop back, and a retreat, wanting to avoid the exchange of knights. As if knights are kept on the board going into an endgame, there a lot of times is more of a chance that the game will not end in a draw. Knights can be pretty tricky, in all areas of the game, especially for you beginners out there. But even, sometimes more experienced players have trouble with the knights. Now, the computer says this is an inaccuracy, and I move 20. I think that's the first inaccuracy of the game so far. Apparently, bishop to g6 would have been better. Repositioning here and attacking the rook. So the game has swung back in white's favor here. And we have a rook exchange. Rook recaptures, grabbing the half open file here, putting a little bit of pressure on this backwards pawn. And now white grabs a half open b file, attacking this backwards pawn. Computer says that's an inaccuracy, and the game has swung back in black's favor here. So apparently bishop to b2 here would have been better, lining up towards the king side, maybe discouraging that knight from jumping forward here again. All right, the game continues with action on the queen side. We have pawns fighting each other, a threat of pushing forward, blocking the bishop, attacking the bishop. So an exchange. And with this move, the game has jumped to almost 3/4 of a pawn worth of material in black's favor. Apparently queen to d2 would have been better, getting the queen off the back rank, aiming at these diagonals. So now we have instead, interesting move here. Instead of capturing with the pawn and then maybe rook capturing we have this queen move. The computer says that is a great move, and it is the best move in the position, and the only one that keeps black's edge here. So what does this move do? Well, it checks the king here, so that's the obvious choice for this move. And now the pawn will be able to capture here and be protected by the queen. So the game continues with king moving towards the center. Usually a good choice as you head into an endgame. The king also helps protect this pawn. And now we continue with the capture. And at this moment, things are even as far as material, but black has a pawn majority on the queen side. And that can be an endgame advantage, although white has a pawn majority in the center and a passed pawn here that will become stronger as it marches up the board. So now we have this bishop move to b2, which earlier was a great move. It was the best move in the game, but now it is a mistake. So once again, we see that slight changes in a position can mean all the difference on a move that was once the best move in the position. Now it's just a mistake. Apparently, once again, queen to d2 would be better. But after this mistake, the game has jumped to almost a pawn and a half worth of material advantage for black, even though material is actually even. So the game continues with a capture here. The best move in the position, attacking the rook, and then after the bishop counterattacks here. So this can be a good strategy. When your opponent attacks, if you can have a more powerful counterattack and are able to ignore what your opponent is doing, you can dictate the flow of the game a little bit better. So the queen is under attack, forcing this queen to make a decision here. What will be played? Let's find out. So knight blocks. Apparently a mistake. It looks like it would have been better to leave that knight on the edge and bring the other knight in here to block. All right. Interesting. That a beginner might think, well, I'm getting the even a world championship player here would think that, okay, let's get that knight off the edge of the board and back towards the center. But apparently the computer does not like that move. Black is still ahead, and the queen didn't want to move, because maybe an attack here, and then this pawn could come under attack. If the queen, tried to move and protect this pawn, where could it go? Anyway, before I dig into that, which is not as important, let's see how things continued here. All right. Whenever you have a pinned piece, such as this knight pinned to the queen, a lot of times it's good to add to the pressure, add an attacker to that pinned piece. So, what will Gukesh do here? Well, he decides to attack the queen. This is an inaccuracy, and now the game is almost even again with only a slight edge for black. So the best move would have been bishop to f7, apparently. Helping guard this diagonal, defend the king side. So the game continues with queen sidestepping the attack, adding a little bit of pressure to this pawn. All right. And then maybe from here, the queen could reposition, creating a battery, adding even more pressure to the knight. So the game continues with a mistake. A mistake has been made by Gukesh here. It looks like a4, getting the passed pawn moving here, would have been better. That would have also protected the bishop when it was here on b3. But now we have a mistake, and the game has jumped to white. Almost a pawn's worth advantage here. So how will things continue? The queen creates the battery, adding more pressure here to this knight. So rook moves over here to help aid in the defense of the knight, but +1 advantage for white at the moment, even though material is +1 with black here. So very interesting that Gukesh is ahead by a pawn, but white is evaluated by the computer as being ahead about the equivalent of a pawn. All right, and that's one of the reasons that chess can be a difficult game. So now we have the best move found by the world champion. He just keeps the pressure on here, keeping the knight pinned, but at the same time dropping back and defending the rook on the open file, which could be a danger here if that rook is captured with check. So rook steps up. Now it's protected by the queen. Best move in the position, and the knight jumps forward, attacking the bishop here. All right, white is still maintaining that almost +1 edge. So bishop retreats. The best move, of course, going here, which the computer stated earlier, that would have been the best move for that bishop. And now the knight jumping into the heart of black's position here. And, well, maybe offering an exchange of rook for knight and bishop here. But it's getting tricky because we have a rook and this battery piling up on the knight here. So it looks like there are about to be some exchanges, and let's see how Gukesh, the young challenger, handles this. We have the capture, and so sure enough, an exchange of knight and bishop for a rook. And after this exchange, for the moment, Gukesh is ahead even more in material by the equivalent of 2 pawns. So, there's still this pressure mounting here. So this is going to be a possible issue. So the best move in the position, we have a capture. And instead of recapturing here, a pawn push. The computer says this is good, but once again, it looks like it would have been better to push one of these passed pawns on the queen side. That is probably black's biggest advantage here, and an argument can be made that he needs to use that advantage. So the game continues with the king racing over here, trying to get over towards the queen side to be able to help stop these passed pawns in the endgame. And the pawn pushes forward. Now, even though that was the best move earlier, now it looks like knight to e5 would have been better. Getting that knight moved forward into the center where it's a little bit closer to some action. All right, queen centralizes. And, all right, we do have a check possibility, but at the moment, the knight would be unprotected if the queen checked there. So the game continues with knight jumping forward, the best move in the position. And now we have the king pressing up towards the center and towards these pawns over here. Let's see how things progress. The best move is found here, attacking the pawns on the king side. And now the game continues with queen trying to stop any counterattack by black over here on the king side. And now queen centralizes. And it looks like white is offering a queen trade. So that is avoided by Gukesh, and we've seen this happen in previous games where the young challenger wished to avoid queen trades, even at the expense of hurting his position a little bit. So let's see what happens here. A repetition of position draw possibility here. All right, will the position be repeated? Well, we have queen to d4, a mistake. And this looks like it will allow a draw here, if the queen, jumps back here to g2. So will the young challenger take the draw? Or will he try and push his queenside pawns? Let's see how things continue here. And once again, it looks like Gukesh tries to avoid going into a drawn endgame, avoids the trade of the queens, and he wants to fight here and continue the game. So we have a check on the king, and now blocked by the rook, the best move. And now white, is still ahead, almost the equivalent of a pawn, and also ahead by +1 in material as well now. So let's see how things continue. We have queen retreating. Queen to e6, the best move according to the computer. All right, a check is on the board. Will it be blocked? Will the king run? Let's find out. The king runs to the edge here, but he does have a possibility of coming out to g6 and getting back into the game in the end game. So queen picks off one of the valuable passed pawns on a5 here. And that's not looking good. Ding Liren is ahead by +2. But after this move, apparently the game is closer to being even here. So just queen to d6 apparently would have been better. Now we have the pawn pushing forward with an attack on the rook. Rook retreats, and the queen centralizes here, pinning the bishop, sort of pinning this bishop to the queen, because the bishop could move, and protect the queen. But let's see what happens next. The queen gets behind the passed pawn. Apparently this is an inaccuracy, and the game is dead even at this point. It looks like queen to a7 would have been better. And then from a7, maybe apply pressure to this bishop. But, at the moment, the queen and knight are protecting it. All right, the game continues with queen to g2, and now this is a mistake. All right, let's see what happens. Instead of capturing the pawn, we have an offer of a queen trade here. And apparently this is a mistake, and the game is dead even. So it looks like bishop to d6 would have been better, attacking the knight. But the game continues with a queen trade, which results in doubled isolated pawns, which could be an endgame weakness, perhaps. Especially with these pawns at the moment, both are on the light squares, and they could become targets of the light squared bishop of blacks. And now we have the pawn pushing forward, and rook blockading. So, it looks like this pawn could be a goner, but not so fast. The knight can jump forward here, attacking the king, and at the same time protecting, and it will be protected by the bishop here. So the game continues with an interesting choice, the best in the game. Instead of protecting the passed pawn, now we have an attack on the rook. So, of course, the rook grabs the other passed pawn, and the game is dead even according to the computer. So now we have a fork. The king steps up, and an exchange of material here. But this is where the game was ended. Probably a draw agreed here, after the king captures. Then, white does have an extra pawn, but you have opposite colored bishops, which, makes it all the more easier to get a draw. And these pawns are doubled and isolated. So a draw is agreed here, and the computer, of course, says that things are a draw after this. All right, well, the tension is building as we get closer and closer to the final stretch in this World Championship. I'm excited to see what happens in the future. And as always, feel free to leave any comments and let me know if you have any opinions, what you think. Also, please like and subscribe for those that haven't already to support the channel. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.